Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Museum of London and Gresham College, and to for me, a new season. And tonight I want to talk about the rhythm of life and about how the heart beats, how it dances. And I'm going to do it in a slightly different way from normal. But first, I want to remind you of what an amazing organ the heart is. This is a slide I showed in my first lecture here a couple of years ago. The heart starts to beat within days of conception, and it never stops, basically, for most of us. It beats 100,000 times a day, 40 million times a year, 3 billion times in your lifespan, and it pumps through an extraordinary amount of tubes in your body. Quite incredible. And it keeps on doing it. Most of the time, you have no idea that it's there. And what I want to do tonight is to talk to you not about its physical structure so much as about how the heart actually beats and how it has a rhythm and a rate and a regularity which keeps all that going. Now, I'm not going to do this on my own. I've got some help. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Nick Buxton, who's going to come up onto the stage in just a minute or two. Nick is a drummer in a band called La Shark. And we're joined by an actor called Hannah Harlin, who's going to be the heart. She's going to dance the actions of the heart to the rhythms that Nick generates, hopefully not using that baseball bat on her in the meantime. So, but there's a bit of science, a bit of biology to get out of the way before we start demonstrating some of these normal and abnormal rhythms. And there are three types of muscle in the human body: skeletal or striated muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And I'm obviously going to be talking about cardiac muscle. A cardiac muscle makes up about two-thirds of the cells, two-thirds of the volume of the cells in the heart. And the rest of the heart is made up of structural tissue, connective tissue, blood vessels, nervous tissue, inflammatory cells, and so on. The basic muscle cell is called a cardiomyocyte, and it's a cylindrical cell about 100 microns long, which is about the thickness of a human hair, and about 10 microns or 20 microns wide. And it has a complex structure with multiple things called sarcomeres inside the multiple myofibrils, and it's wrapped around with an insulating layer of lipid. And this is a single heart muscle cell from a mouse in culture, showing how it contracts. You could see it has a striated appearance, and it contracts automatically on its own. The cells themselves are branched, unlike striated or skeletal muscle that you use in your peripheral muscles in the gym. They're branched and joined together, and they're joined in these things called intercalated discs, where there's a kind of intercellular velcro called a desmosome that holds them together. And there's some very clever little junctions called gap junctions, which allow the rapid movement of ions, electrical ions, from one side of the membrane to the other. And these are quite critical in the distribution of the electrical signal across the heart, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Now, this is a little animation of how a piece of muscle contracts. The basic unit of a myofibril is this called a sarcomere between these two dark lines called Z lines. And I'll run the animation and show you. In each one, there's a thick filament which is made of myosin, and a thin one which is made of actin. That's myosin, and the next one that lights up is actin. Myosin is connected to the M line, and actin is connected to the Z line. So when those two molecules slide over each other, it pulls those two Z lines together, and the muscle fiber gets shorter. Now, when you focus deep in here, it's much more beautiful, I think. The myosin molecule forms cross bridges with the actin molecule on binding sites, and this movement called the power stroke pulls the actin molecule along. And obviously, the faster it's happening, the faster the contraction takes place. This is energy dependent. It requires adenosine triphosphate ADP to be both hydrolyzed and introduced. And then when the ATP comes in, that bond can be broken down again, and it's ready to reattach to a new binding site. So the ATP comes, releases the binding site, rehydrolyzes and attaches to the binding site on the actin and pulls it along. That would be nice and simple, but of course it's more complicated. On the actin molecule, there are other molecules called troponin, which require calcium to release a third molecule called tropomyosin to open out those binding sites which are otherwise covered. So without calcium, the contraction of the muscle can't take place. And the movement of that tropomyosin away from the binding sites and the binding of calcium is what makes it possible for that muscle to contract. So the reason I'm showing you that is that I really want you to remember how important calcium is for this mechanism. Now, in order for the heart cell to beat like that, it needs some sort of electrical signal. And the electrical signal ends up getting a bunch of calcium into that muscle and allowing it to contract in the mechanism I've shown you. So here is a very short animation, as simple as we can make it, to show you how this works. This is a cardiac cell, and it's surrounded by an insulating lipid layer, which allows some control of the voltage on either side of that membrane. And we're going to represent sodium as a salt cellar, calcium as a piece of bone, and potassium as a banana. And inside the cell, if you think of it in terms of volume, the potassium is 90% full, and the sodium and the calcium are 10% full. Outside the cell, the sodium and the calcium are 90% full, but the potassium is only 10% full. That means, converting that into positive charges, that you're more positive on the outside of the cell. On the inside, you can say add it up here as percentages, and you end up with more positive ions outside than there are inside, and the cell is effectively negative in relation to the outside world. And that's its resting state, as we sit there with the heart muscle doing nothing. But suddenly, under a stimulus, sodium moves in, potassium moves out, and calcium moves in. And that calcium causes the heart muscle to contract, or is associated with that pathway. And that is the signal that makes the muscle contract. You can see that as a voltage if you measure it in millivolts. So at the beginning of that transfer, sodium leaks into the cell, it becomes a little bit more positive, suddenly reaches a threshold and shoots up to become completely positive before a balance occurs between the flow of calcium and potassium in and out of the cell, and a plateau is reached, and then gradually, where the cell doesn't like this state of affairs, it tries to pump all those ions back out again and restore itself to a normal intracellular negative position and get back to a baseline resting membrane potential, which is going to be showing up as a horizontal line. So its resting state is horizontal minus 90. If we just see that go again, sudden change, drop down, plateau phase, where the calcium and potassium are balanced, and then it gradually pumps all those ions back to a normal state, and the final position, the resting membrane potential, is horizontal. Nothing's going to happen to that heart cell until it gets another electrical stimulus spreading over its surface, telling it to contract. Now, fortunately for us, and why our heart's beating all the time, is that there are some cells in the heart which don't have that flat horizontal line, like in this position, at the end of the action potential. So this is the action potential. At this point, the normal heart cells are just resting, waiting for something to happen. But in the pacemaker cells, which I'll show you where they are in a minute, they gradually depolarize on their own, just automatically. The sodium and potassium and calcium exchange, and gradually you get a sudden start of an action potential on their own, automatically, under the influence of some nervous stimuli and hormones like adrenaline, for example, and fear standing up in front of you lot. It will change its rate and go automatically. Now, the movement of electrical ions is very, very complicated. I'm just going to show you how complicated without explaining it. the automaticity of this happens at membrane level and within the cell in the thing called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, where there's two kinds of clock, a membrane clock and a calcium clock. I have absolutely no intention of explaining this in detail. It's not the place to do it. But I wanted to show you there's a lot known about it. It is incredibly complicated and fortunately very useful. So at the membrane level, the way these ions, sodium, potassium and calcium, flux across the membrane occurs automatically on a cycle through this clock. And it's matched up with an intracellular calcium clock, and you end up with a process which involves depolarization and repolarization, ignition and resetting, which allows these cells to work automatically. It is truly complicated, and to give you some idea of the massive amount of interactions which take place every single time a heart cell beats, just look at this diagram going by. This is a field of study in its own right, and you and I should probably be glad it is, because each one of these pathways and mechanisms is known to pharmacological companies as sites which can act to control abnormal heart rhythms. And so the more is known about this, the more likely it is that we can find drugs to interact with the heart. That's the sort of background chemistry of the action potential. The ECG, electrocardiogram, which you see on television programs when you attach electrodes to the peripheral body, is a summation of all of those action potentials in the heart measured peripherally. And this animation shows you how the heartbeat starts, and I can let it run on a loop so we can show you. At the beginning, the stimulus starts right out here in the sinoatrial node and passes across the atria, which I'll show you in a second. So the stimulus is going to start here, that's where the pacemaker cells are, spread across the atrium. The only place it can get through to the ventricles is through this, which is called the AV node, atrioventricular node, down this bundle, the bundle of His, which splits into two, left and right down to the apex, and then back up again. And it's very good that the AV node has a little bit of built-in delay to it, because it allows the atria to empty properly, and it's very good that the signal passes down to the apex before it stimulates a contraction, because otherwise it would be like squeezing a toothpaste tube from the wrong end. And you blow out blood through the apex of the heart instead of sending it forwards to the artery to the lungs or to the artery to the body. So the atrium starts it, spreads across the atrium, AV node, bundle of His, down towards the apex and back up again. And on the ECG, which has been running at the same place, when you get the signal coming through at the atria, it spreads across at this point. Atria start to contract. Then it reaches the ventricles and the signal goes all the way down to the apex, back up again and down before it spreads, contracts, and then the whole thing repolarizes and gets ready for the next beat. And the next signal to come from the SA node, AV node, bundle of His, and then these pathways. Here it is again, SA node spreading across the atrium. This is much more anatomical, showing the AV bundle, which I can damage really easily when I'm repairing a hole in the heart, and these fibers. If you look at the first branches of these bundles, they go to these muscles which are holding the valves in place. And those muscles are called papillary muscles, and this signal getting there first is a bit like the pre-tensioning devices you have on your seatbelts when you have a car crash. They tighten up before the ventricles contract, so the valves don't blow back into the atria. So once again, that's a normal ECG, and this is how we see it with multiple electrodes around the chest, and I'm going to be concentrating on looking mainly at ECGs from just a standard lead 1 or lead 2 ECG. Now, I need my friends up here on the stage, Hannah and Nick, because we're going to try and demonstrate to you some of these things. So Hannah, as you can see, is beautifully dressed for the occasion. On her left side is where all the red blood is, and the left atrium at the top and the left ventricle at the bottom. And on the right side is blue blood, right atrium, right ventricle. So every time the atria are going to beat, Hannah will make an atrial movement like this, and every time a ventricle beats, it'll be like this. And so if we just show you a normal heart rate at the moment, so Nick is going to drum out a normal heart rhythm, and this is what it'll look like. It's fine. So for most of us, that's what we're doing. If you're an athlete, you have a slower resting heart rate, somewhere between 40 and 50. So we're going to show you a slow, normal sinus heart rate. That's great. And that's Jensen Button at rest. Me standing here, and probably Hannah and Nick as well, we're going to be having a faster pulse rate, but still normal. A normal heart rate, but faster. Sinus tachycardia. Thank you. Actually, we thought at one point when we were rehearsing this that it would be fun to have this half of the room as the atrium and this half of the room as the ventricles. We may still do that when it gets really tricky. So those are normal ones. I wanted to now start to talk about what happens when it all goes pear-shaped, when rhythms aren't what they are. And there are 4 main types of abnormal rhythms that we're going to try and demonstrate to you in the next few minutes. The first is when you have extra or premature beats. The second is when you have rhythm which start above the ventricles in the atria, which are just too fast. Supraventricular, above the ventricles, tachycardia is fast. Then some ventricular arrhythmias. Actually, arrhythmias is the wrong word, I think. It's crept in from America. It should be dysrhythmias because they're not absent rhythms. They're just abnormally rhythms, but hey. And then there's some important slow rhythms. Some of these are really hard to demonstrate, and I'm not going to show an extremely detailed map of all the rare ones that there are. We're just going to show you some general principles. So let's start looking at some extra or premature beats. Now, in this rhythm, we see you have a set of normal beats and then one which comes in early, followed by a compensatory pause while the heart recovers, and then one which goes on afterwards. So let's try and just demonstrate that. Normal beats. And an extra beat, and then a pause. And these come from a little signal starting somewhere up in the atria, quite close to where the SA node starts, but it's not the SA node, it's another automatic focus of some kind. And we all have these, they're very common. We often feel a skip beat or a minor palpitation, especially if you like espresso. It's more common after you have coffee. And you can have premature beats which come from the ventricles. So these are coming below the AV junction, and they start somewhere, almost anywhere in fact, in the atrium. There's a single beat, something triggers it for some reason, and starts a ventricular beat. So let's try to do that. Here there'll be no atrial sound. Thank you. So you see that there's no atrial beat, that's just a ventricular focus happening on its own. Again, it doesn't really matter, it's felt as a skip beat or palpitation. It gets a bit more worrying if you have a few together, but just the odd one, all of us have those. Now, we're going to show you some faster rhythms. And as we move on through this talk, these become more important medically. This supraventricular tachycardias are rhythms which start in the atrium and are often associated with things called re-entry processes. So they're actually little cycles of activity, like in the atrium here, where a current passes around in a little circle from either some abnormal fibers or abnormal muscle fibers themselves, abnormal pathways, which could be congenital, or can be a result of scarring or damage. They can occur like this. And there are fundamentally two kinds. We're going to show you, first of all, the kind of supraventricular tachycardia which comes on suddenly. It's called paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, and that starts off with a normal rate running at around 65 or 70. And at some point, it suddenly goes faster. Another point, it goes back to normal. So it's a paroxysm. It's just coming on for a short period of time before reverting to normal. Now, during the time it's going fast, it's inefficient. And the faster it goes, the more inefficient it comes, because your heart doesn't have enough time to fill and not enough time to eject. And so the longer it goes on and the faster it is, the worse it gets. In fact, we were on holiday last week in Spain, and we were just watching the beautiful Alhambra when there was a lady leaning against a wall with the paramedics with her and put a stethoscope on her chest and said, "Oh, pulse rate's 200," and she must be having paroxysmal SVT at that point. And the rates can go up to 270, which we're not going to demonstrate because that gets a bit kind of killing for Hannah. But there is another type of SVT which is called automatic, where it gradually rises to a very fast heart rate. We are going to show you what that sounds like when it runs to a very fast heart rate.
I can demonstrate for you 280.
Let's do that one. And these aren't fictitious rhythms. This is real stuff that we sometimes see. So if you've got someone where the heart is beating at that rate, there's no wonder that you can't generate sufficient cardiac output to feel good. You're going to feel bad because there's not enough blood coming around with each beat. Okay, the next one we want to show you is a lovely rhythm called atrial flutter. I think it's easier if I show you this on the screen first before we demonstrate it. So here you have a regular atrial beat going at about 300 to 400 beats per minute. And there isn't time for that AV node to recover. You have a focus in the atrium like this, which is triggering the signal, and then it could be on either side. But fortunately, the AV node here can't conduct every beat because it has a fixed built-in refractory period or rest period of 330 milliseconds. So what we're going to show you now is a fast atrial rate, which we'll start with, and then show you how the ventricles respond to that at a regular interval. So that's the atrial rate going on there. Already you can see how some of these rhythms can be quite disturbing if you've got them, if this is you. And apart from anything else, that atrium is jerking like this. It's not emptying ever properly. And so the blood inside has areas of stasis where it can clot more easily. And that clot can be sent through into the ventricles and then off into your brain and give you a stroke. The fastest one-to-one conduction rate you can get like that is at 300 beats per minute, which is very fast. We've just heard 280, which is not a nice sound. So mostly these conductions are at 2-to-1, as you saw there, roughly 3-to-1, and that is how it works. But the pulse rate you feel at the wrist is regular because it's coming through at regular intervals. This is, as I said, an inefficient heart rate. We have various drugs and treatment. We can give electric shocks, and I'll show you in a minute something called ablation. But the stasis, that clot formation, is dangerous, and it's best, usually, if this happens for consistent periods of time, to be anticoagulated. Now, these re-entry circuits, these little re-entry circuits, often occur in well-known places. And if you look down on the AV junction from above, the atrioventricular junction, you're looking at the two major valves of the heart, mitral and tricuspid, you can see that the heart is split into areas where we know that some of these pathways exist. And now, thanks to modern computing, it's possible to work in a cardiac catheter laboratory, and using a catheter like these ones, which are coming in from a peripheral vein, when they touch the heart, they change the impedance, and the computer will build up gradually a three-dimensional model of the heart. And once that model has been built, you can then identify the area in which the abnormal pathway exists and use either heat or cold to damage it. And if you look at the bottom of this trace, you can see this patient has a very fast SVT, which suddenly has changed into sinus rhythm as we burnt that little piece of tissue. And that's what is called ablation. As anybody in the audience who's had atrial fibrillation and had an ablation will recognize what that's like. So I'm now going to talk about atrial fibrillation, which is the next rhythm that we're going to show you. Atrial fibrillation much more commonly starts near the pulmonary veins on the left side from another one of these re-entry circuits. And the difference here is that the very fast heart rate in the atria is so fast that you only get an occasional conduction going through into the ventricle, not a regular one. And fibrillation means quivering. And we're going to try and demonstrate that to you now by showing you, first of all, some normal rhythm. And then we're going to just turn on some fibrillation of the atria, which is where they're quivering. And they're not generating any kind of forward flow at all. It's just sitting there like a fat sack of worms. Not in Hannah's case, obviously, that would be inappropriate, but just like a bag of worms. And only every now and again does a ventricular rate get through. And it's irregular. So if you're feeling the pulse at the wrist, it is irregularly irregular. And that's the difference between some of the atrial dysrhythmias and atrial fibrillation. Thank you. It's hard to do. I like the sound, though. And that has the same sort of risks. There are often underlying causes. Atrial fibrillation occurs in 3 to 4% of the population. Once you get to 80, it's 14% of the population. And if both your parents had it, genetically, you're 4 times likely to have it than the rest of the population. Same sort of treatments, and you must anticoagulate these patients. And very often nowadays, we do use these ablation techniques to treat it. Now, the conduction system of the heart, once again, if I can make my torch work, starts with the sinuatrial node, AV node, and all the way down here. You're very lucky that our body has certain escape rates. Each part of the conduction system has its own automatic rate. So if the SA node fails for some reason, then the AV node can take over at a slower rate. And if the AV node fails as well, then the ventricles can take over. And we're going to try and demonstrate that to you now. So we'll start off with some normal heart rate. And then if the SA node packs up, the atria stop working, and you just have a slower ventricular rate. And thank heavens, because if the AV node packs up as well, the ventricles can go at an even slower rate. But that will keep you alive for a bit until we're able to do something about it. So that's your fail-safe mechanism, each part of the heart working down, having an escape rate all of its own. Thank you. Some of you will be familiar with the term heart block, which is where the really slow rhythms of the heart get perfectly demonstrated. And we're going to talk a little bit about heart block by just first of all describing them in degrees, and they're called first degree, second degree, and third degree heart block. This is normal with a normal P wave, and the first type of heart block you see is first degree, where there's a delayed conduction between the SA node and the AV node. And you can see that in this, the signal distance between the P wave, the atrial signal, and the QRS complex, the ventricular signal, gets longer. It's a little bit longer. That's normal, and this is a first degree block. So if I get you to do normal, and then we'll do a first degree block. Okay. So everything is just slightly stretched, but it's essentially a normal rhythm. Thank you. I must say, I think it's fantastic that a photographer and an actor and a drummer can learn these things in a few days when it took me 30 years to have any clue about how it worked. I feel pretty humbled, I must say. Then we have second degree heart block and finally complete heart block or third degree block. They're a bit more complicated, so we're going to go into a wee bit more detail. And some of these are really hard to show. When we've been rehearsing these, they've been extremely difficult to do. So I'm going to try and explain the first one and then see if we can make it happen. So this is called second degree heart block type 1, Mobius type 1, Venki-back phenomenon. And what happens here is the distance between the atria and the ventricle gets longer, longer and longer until eventually it doesn't get through to the ventricles at all. And there's a gap. And then it starts again normally. I'm going to try and show you that one now. Yeah. So that's what it is. But you can see it almost sounds like chaos, even though we've programmed this in advance so that it does that rhythm absolutely regularly, just like it does in real life. But it's almost impossible when we try to rehearse it as the dancer to separate those two rhythms in your head, even though both these guys are very, very musical. So that's the Venki-back phenomenon, progressive extension of the PR interval until you drop a beat and then recover. In the second type of heart block, you have runs, Mobius type 2, you have runs of rhythm, da-dump, da-dump, and then you just suddenly drop one of those. I think we can show you that one. So you get the general idea here that you're losing the beats, just not conducted through. And it means that your overall cardio output is going to be reduced and your peripheral pulses are going to be at a slower rate. And this very often progresses to complete heart block, which we'll show you soon, and usually needs pacing. Actually, both type 1 and type 2 end up with something which is a little bit easier to demonstrate, which is a 2-to-1 rhythm. So every alternate one gets conducted. You want to do that to you two guys? So so 2-to-1 heart block where it's just a little bit something fantastic. Thank you. Third degree heart block. This is probably the most difficult thing that we tried to do between us together. Because what happens here is that the atria are carrying on at their own regular rate, and the ventricles also have a regular rate, but it's different because there's no connected signal. The ventricular rate will be slower, and the atrial rate will be its normal rate.
I had to program this here. I
Yeah.
can't actually play it.
Now, if you're very lucky, when these rhythms concatenate, you get atria and ventricle together, and then you get a normal volume pulse. So you will get a fairly regular pulse, but of varying volume. It's quite hard drumming, isn't it? In fact, I was told that Ligeti was very interested in prime numbers, and he wrote a piece where the one part is written in a certain prime number and the second one in the second time signature, so that every now and again they collide and make a harmony, but they don't do it normally, which is roughly what's going on with that. These are treated by pacemakers, which fortunately have improved a lot since the 1930s and are now small enough to be implanted easily within the skin. And you can have multiple electrodes placed in different parts of the heart to maximize the efficiency. They can be interrogated by computer and by telephone, and you can have remote control of these things, which makes life very, very much different. Pacemakers have saved so many lives. Now, there are two more types of heart block we want to show you, because if you remember, the AV node and AV bundle split into two, a left bundle and a right bundle. And you can get a block here where you get usually associated with some underlying heart disease like coronary artery disease or scarring. The left bundle branch blocks, and you don't get conduction around here. Any conduction that occurs has to spread from right ventricle across to the left ventricle, so left ventricular contraction gets delayed. And that you can see looking at the ECG on the central V1 lead, you see that, and on the right outside on the chest on V6, you see an M pattern, a W and an M, like that. And the contraction must go from right to left, and left ventricular contraction is delayed. And we're going to show you that now. It's normal again. This is like in the London Samba Club. It's about to start any minute now. Okay, and unsurprisingly, you can also have that occurring in the right bundle, and you get right ventricular contraction delayed. Let's show you that one. I love it. Thank you. Okay, we thought those were difficult. Now it's going to get harder and more dangerous. More dangerous for you, more dangerous for us, especially more dangerous for Hannah. Because these are fast ventricular rhythms. These are rhythms now which are beginning to get life-threatening. And somewhere in the ventricles, a stimulus occurs, one stimulus, one place, which is causing this heart rate to go really fast. What did we decide we'd run this faster? So I'm going to show you 160, and it's a very regular ventricular rate only. There's no atrial contraction, it's just ventricular rate, very fast. The longer this goes on for, the lower your blood pressure, the more faint you become, the more exhausted your heart gets, the less cardiac output there is, and the more life-threatening it is. That one's bad enough. It's fast and ineffective as a rhythm, and the rates can go really high. But there's another polymorphic ventricular tachycardia where instead of just one local place triggering the heartbeats, there's multiple areas of the ventricle starting off at roughly the same times. And because of that, you get what turns out to be a regular beat, but it's a very different electrical signal each time, and a very different force of contraction each time. We'll try and demonstrate that to you. The French call this torsade des pointes. So I think that's like the Alamo myself, that the Indians are coming over the hill. But this one, if you get an ECG, if your ECG looks like this, you will collapse and you will faint. And you might even have a cardiac arrest and need resuscitating. And you will need resuscitating after this rhythm, which is the final one we want to show you, which is called ventricular fibrillation, VF. And remember that fibrillation is this bag of worms, this quivering of the atrium. This is quivering of the ventricles and is much more life-threatening, and untreated is fatal. So let's just show you and listen to what that looks like. So the ventricles are doing nothing. There's no blood being squeezed out at all. And if that goes on for any length of time, there's no blood getting to your brain, and you collapse and fall to the floor, elegantly and theatrically. Now, I would normally, in the hospital, come over and resuscitate you with electrical leads, and you get instantly better and stand up and recover. And it's very difficult to imagine how that might be. So I'm going to have to show you the only bit of real life in this talk, which is ventricular fibrillation as we see it in the operating room. Because once you've seen this, I think you have a really good idea of why ventricular fibrillation is so critical. So this is the ECG that you're seeing on the monitor in the operating room. And here's the heart, just quivering, doing nothing. And in a minute, you'll see 2 electrodes coming in there, which will send a DC, direct current shock, across the heart, and it immediately reboots. It's like turning your computer on and off. It reboots, depolarizes the whole heart, and with any luck, it'll start again in a normal rhythm. So let's just do ventricular fibrillation one more time. So poor Hannah now has got no blood going to the brain. Things aren't looking good. And she's going to collapse to the floor any minute. Most of us, when this happens, aren't going to have the privilege that I have in the operating room of having a defibrillator in my hands where I can just sort this out. And in fact, if someone collapses in the street in front of you like this, you have no idea what's happening. And I'm very pleased to say that we got a little piece of advice that we can have tonight. This is advice from the person who trained me to resuscitate people. It's called Denise Wellesby. And I've asked Denise to come along tonight and tell you how to resuscitate someone who might be in the street. The reason it's important to me is because this actually happened 2 days after Denise trained me. Someone arrested in my house, and I had to resuscitate someone to get them round. So you need to learn this. Denise Wellesby.
Do you need some help?
Yes, go and see. There's a lady collapsed over there.
Okay, what happened? Can you hear me?
I was lecturing.
Can you hear me? Can you come over and give me a hand?
Yeah.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. She's not breathing. I need you to dial 999 and get me a defib.
Okay.
Is there a station or a...
Yeah, I saw one over here.
Yeah, it's a green heart with some lightning in it.
This is it.
Oh, that's him. That's him. Superb.
Okay.
I'll do that. There's pictures. Brilliant.
Apply pads. Plug in pads connected. Stay clear of patient. Analyzing.
There's that VF.
Stay clear of patient. Shock advised.
Stand clear.
Stay clear. Shock delivered. Begin CPR.
And these devices you'll see around London in stations, football grounds, everything like that, they self-teach you what's going on with the heart and instruct you what to do based on the ECG that you've seen. If it detects VF, it's going to shock you, and on the paddles it shows you where to stick these things on. So it's pretty well easy to do. And it gives you a rhythm that's very important as to how to do it. We're going to show you in a minute another way of doing that rhythm, but this is the most important thing.
I'm just going to do chest compressions because it's got pretty big herpes.
Yeah.
Fibromas. Don't want to do that, mate.
And actually, modern resuscitation, giving mouth-to-mouth is much less necessary. It's been discovered that the more you do this, you usually get enough air movement in and out of the lungs to keep someone alive until the person I called on my phone arrives with the ambulance. And now I rather suspect that you've reversed everything and that Hannah is now recovered. Now, we haven't tried to teach you everything about rhythms of the heart, and I read this about Ringo Starr, which seems pretty self-evident to me. We all have an innate rhythm. The timing of it and the way that rhythm works often in our minds comes from the heartbeat. You try and teach it to other people like we've tried to talk about it tonight, and it's quite hard. And I don't know how much you've taken away from it. That final lesson is the most important. And we need to show you it again in a slightly different way and maybe with a slightly different rhythm. And I think this is a wonderful piece of film. So let's see how it works.
There are times in life when being tough comes in handy. Say some numpty collapses in front of you and your mum or dad ain't around. What do? We need a volunteer that ain't breathing. Here's one I made earlier. First off, check you're not in any danger. Then check him over. If he ain't breathing or making noises like this, then he's having a cardiac arrest. Shout for help. Help! Then call 999. I know, don't panic. The geezer on the end of the phone will tell you what to do. And no kissing. Don't even kiss your nan on the lips. Lock your fingers knuckles up and push hard and fast here on the sovereign to the tune of Staying Alive. Push down 5 to 6 centimetres. That's about 3 inches, whatever they are. Push hard and fast, go on. Better a cracked rib than him kicking the bucket. Do this until help arrives.
That's my boy.
Remember, shout for help, call 999, push hard and fast to Staying Alive.
Hands only, CPR. It's not as hard as it looks.
Very much indeed.
Particularly, of course, I hope you'll join me in thanking Nick Buxton and Hannah Harlin and Denise Wellesby for joining me tonight. Thank you very much indeed.